everyone, welcome to the Whitney. Good afternoon. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's program, A Century of Displacement, Climate, and Mass Migration, and for being here on time. I have a feeling people will be joining us. So I'm going to just do a quick introduction and we'll get into it. The occasion for this program is the exhibition Josh Kline, Project for a New American Century, currently on view here at the Whitney across both the 5th and 8th floor galleries. Hopefully many of you know, the exhibition surveys over a decade of Kline's work and includes new installations and moving image works that address the climate crisis. Presented for the first time at the Whitney, these projects approach the hotter, more dangerous future on the horizon from the perspective of essential workers who will inevitably be left to pick up the pieces, a future that's already here. In an era defined by escalating crises, Kline's work offers a visceral warning and calls for a more human future. Today's program grows out of these works and their attention to the human causes and human costs and societal disruptions of climate change. I want to express deepest thanks to Josh Kline for instigating today's program with this work and your commitment to urgently bringing attention to the truly frightening reality that we are all facing, whether we know it or not. I also want to acknowledge Christopher Liu, former curator here at the Whitney, who organized the exhibition with McLean Groff, curatorial assistant. Today's program would not have been possible without the great partnership of Dr. Haley Mellin. Thank you, Haley, for your expert guidance and vision in developing and realizing this incredible series of talks and the conversation that will follow. We're so grateful to have Dr. Benjamin Strauss, Amali Tower, and David Wallace-Wells here with us. Haley will introduce each of them fully before they speak. So I need to acknowledge Jake Biddle, who, as some of you may know, was originally scheduled to be part of this event. And I just want to shout out Jake and his work. He's a reporter who covers climate change, energy, housing, and other topics. He writes for Grist and is the author of The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration, which just came out this spring, and which I highly recommend. Unfortunately, Jake wasn't able to be here today, and David Wallace-Wells graciously agreed to take his place. As you will hear from our speakers today, climate-related displacement is a possibility in the future, but is not just a possibility in the future, but an accelerating reality of the present. This topic hits close to home here at the Whitney, whereas some of you may know, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City just after the Whitney began construction on our current building. The building you are in was redesigned with a flood mitigation system and other precautions for resilience and protection in response, but I think we now have to ask, how long will they last? The Whitney's site is also marked by many centuries of colonialism that are an inextricable part of the climate crisis. The Whitney is located in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people. Due to the ongoing effects of settler colonialism, the Lenape today live in a diaspora across what is now known as the United States and Canada. And if you're joining us online, I hope you'll take a moment to identify and recognize the Indigenous people who have always and continue to steward the land from where you're joining us. I'm now going to turn things over to Josh Kline. He will be followed by Haley, and then we will hear individual presentations from each speaker, followed by a conversation, and we are saving time at the end for your questions. When the program concludes, you're all invited to also visit the exhibition until the museum closes at 6 p.m., and we'll stay as close to the schedule as possible with a break at around 2:30, resuming again at 2:45. The restrooms, should you need them, are located just outside the theater on this floor. And thank you again all for making time on a summer Sunday afternoon to learn together about this really important topic. So Josh Kline is best known for creating immersive installations using video, sculpture, photography, and design, questioning how emergent technologies are being used to change human life in the 21st century. At its core, Kline's prescient practice is focused on work and class, exploring how today's most urgent social and political issues, climate change, automation, disease, and the weakening of democracy, impact the people who make up the labor force. And Josh Kline lives and works in New York City, and we're so thrilled to have him with us today and to kick off the program. So thanks again for being here.
Can you all hear me? Okay, so thank you, Megan. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. In 2014, I started sketching out a cycle of science fiction installations about the 21st century. Each chapter in the cycle would deal with a specific set of key issues that at the time seemed certain to define human life in the 21st century, even if those issues might have felt nascent in 2014. Works and installations from the cycle's first 4 chapters appear upstairs on the 5th and 8th floors of the museum. It probably won't surprise a lot of you that much of my work about the future is actually rooted in an understanding of the past, especially the history of the early 20th century, which has so many disturbing similarities to our own time. From the vantage point of 1913, it was possible that you could have seen much of what would define the 20th century already there in embryonic form. You might have suspected that mass mechanized warfare, electronic broadcast mass media, and revolutions in civil rights might sweep the world in the coming decades. In my original outlines, the middle chapter about climate change was always intended to be the cycle's core. A decade ago, it seemed clear that by the middle of the 21st century, the consequences of anthropogenic climate change, like human-made climate change and global warming, would be disrupting the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, wiping away the world's coasts, and with them, the world's great coastal cities, and unleashing not only a torrent of meltwater from the ice caps and glaciers, but a massive flood of traumatized refugees. For some of us, there really is a shocking moment when the climate crisis lands like a UFO in your life. For me, that moment came when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in fall 2012, turning out the lights in lower Manhattan for 2 weeks. That was probably the moment where it sunk in for me just how fragile our civilization actually is and how sea level rise could become a very personal reality in my own life and in the lives of people I know. In early 2022, an intergovernmental report made by several American federal agencies, including NASA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the US Geological Survey projected around a foot of sea level rise around the world by 2050. If you live in a coastal city, like for instance, New York City, where we are today, and you're alive 25 years from now in 2040 or 2050, there's a good chance you will be a climate refugee. The images in the slideshow behind me are from my new installation that debuted here at the Whitney for my show. It's titled Personal Responsibility, and is the center of my project about the climate crisis. For another month, it's installed on the museum's 8th floor. The installation takes the form of a refugee camp, set in 2050 or 2060, or maybe sooner, colored like the skies we saw in New York a couple weeks ago on what people now call the smog day. Inside the tent sculptures that make up the installation, there are a series of videos, fictional interviews with future climate refugees who've survived the kinds of disasters that scientists predict will be commonplace in the coming decades. The survivors both tell their fictional survival stories and have a conversation about responsibility. Who is responsible, and can anything be done? In the gallery that comes after that installation is a short 16mm film titled Adaptation that features a group of essential workers. In the film, you see them emerge from the water in a flooded future Manhattan, like they're wearing diving, the future equivalent of like construction gear for divers. And they emerge from the water in a future flooded Manhattan and sail through the city at the end of their workday. I don't share their imaginary backstory in the film or in the wall texts. I want to leave it open for the viewer. But I always imagined those people as refugees from New York, living in climate refugee camps on higher ground in New Jersey or upstate in Westchester, coming into the city to do like volunteer recovery work. The scale of displacement and resettlement that will be needed, the number of people who are going to become migrants or refugees over the next 7 decades, is going to be unprecedented in human history. When people look back at the 21st century, will they remember it as the century of AI and gene editing, or as a century of displacement and mass flows of refugees? As an artist, I'm dealing with fiction. I'm making science fiction about the future. I'm not a scientist. As an artist, I want to use the platform that I have to both raise awareness about these issues and also to help make them personal, to take the predictions of scientists and make them understandable on an emotional level. I think that's vital. Since so much of, sorry, I'm reading this morning. It's a little early. Since so much of our future is decided at the ballot box in places like the United States and Europe, and ultimately our voting habits are guided by emotions. At the end, though, we really do need to turn to scientists and researchers and educators to get the facts, to understand the nonfiction of all this, what is actually being predicted by the people who understand these phenomena and how these phenomena are already affecting people around the world today. These are the people who can tell us what our window to act is as both individuals and as a society. So I am honored to share the stage this afternoon with a group of people who are dealing with facts instead of fiction. I'm going to introduce this afternoon's moderator, my friend Dr. Haley Mellin, who will introduce our speakers. I've known Haley Mellin for a decade. Haley is an artist and land conservationist. The art industry has a carbon footprint, and she's one of the first people in our field to engage with the auditing of carbon emissions and mitigation measures around the activities of art museums, nonprofits, commercial galleries, and artist studios. To this end, Haley founded the nonprofit Art to Acres to support global large-scale land conservation. To engage climate sustainability within the art community, Haley co-founded Conserve.org, the Environmental Council at MoCA in LA, Art and Climate Action, Artists Commit, GCC Los Angeles, and GCC New York. In her art, Haley focuses on observational painting in nature, recently on sites that she has been working to conserve. Haley initiated the first carbon emissions calculations for museum exhibitions in the United States and Germany, including for the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Guggenheim, ICA Miami, and Kunstmuseum Bonn. These calculations involve carbon emissions reduction education and institutional sustainability advising. For these pro bono emissions assessments, Haley received grants from the Tager Foundation in 2022 and 2023. Haley is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. She received a PhD from New York University in Visual Culture and Education and attended the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. Please join me in welcoming Haley Mellin.
Thank you, Josh. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you, Josh, for instigating the programming here today. Your work and your artistic presence is one of generosity. Thank you also to Megan from the Education Department at the Whitney Museum for supporting all aspects and planning of this programming. It is an honor to be here with those in person and watching remotely to expand a century of displacement, climate, and mass migration. A series of talks in conjunction with Josh Kline's landmark exhibition, Project for a New American Century, currently on view at this museum. Today's educational series on climate displacement is without precedent at an American art museum. It makes sense for it to happen here at the Whitney Museum of American Art, with its history and education, and with the museum's galleries looking out onto the sea, a central topic of today's talks. I'd like to give some backstory. As an artist, I moved to New York and began my life here teaching at the Studio Museum of Harlem and attending the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program. The Whitney Study Program was led by Ron Clark, and in my opinion, was one of the more experiential and affordable educations that a young artist could receive. From my perspective in work on large-scale land conservation, I first experienced Josh Kline's work a decade ago and was mesmerized. He was creating 3D prints in a digital lab near Washington Square Park with the technical expertise of a colleague we shared named Taylor Absher. I was teaching at the time and completing my doctoral studies, and would see glimpses of works through the interior window of the lab. Those pieces, in production state, later became Josh's 2013 exhibition at 47 Canal entitled Quality of Life. They became some of them. I was transfixed by the accuracy and potency with which he worked, and they were exhibited with a range of videos and other installed pieces. Over the past decade, a chapter of Josh's work has focused on the deep history of climate and industrialization in the global north. Some notes taken while experiencing Josh's climate change chapter include sedimentation from the Potomac River, poetry by the artist, sand from Coney Island, climate denier presidents, melting buildings, and Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. His series, titled Personal Responsibility, in part exhibited upstairs, asks, does the accountability for this crisis rest on individuals, or does it rest with governments? Who is responsible to fix climate as a crisis? This is one of the questions I'd like for us to focus on today. His work exhibits how an artist can move dialogues forward, in presence, in a personal and lived experience. In a public conversation last week, co-organized by the European nonprofit Art 2030 and the Emilio Ambaz Institute for the Joint Study of the Built and Natural Environment at MoMA, Josh noted, there is a different type of time that is present in an art exhibition. Being physically present in the space, the works can reach you in a way that maybe the glut of media possibly cannot. An exhibition can have a real impact on how people experience things. People spend longer with art, and they take it seriously in another way. As we unfold the three talks today, I'd like to first engage in definitions. The word climate is defined as long-term weather. In turn, the word weather is defined as the state of the atmosphere. As such, climate references the state of the atmosphere over time. While atmosphere exists in the space between things, it affects everything. Carbon dioxide is colorless. We cannot see it, and thus it is interesting on a different dimension from the perspective of visual art. Since it is not visible, museums are turning to calculations to begin to understand their carbon emissions, to quantify and work on reduction. While we can't see CO2, increasingly we see the effect on a daily basis in its accumulation, such as the orange skies over Manhattan last month in June 2023. Today, the planet is at least 1.2 degrees Celsius or 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than it was before the Industrial Revolution. Half of the emissions that we produced in the history of humanity from the burning of fossil fuels have been released in the last 30 years. According to a World Bank report, climate change will push over 200 million people to migrate in the coming 30 years. We are in a climate emergency. Today we will talk about how fast climate change is unfolding and the unjust way it is driving extinction, global suffering, and mass displacement, often most affecting the poorest and least adaptable communities. Over the past decade, I shared conversations with Josh on environmental justice and the meta crisis. And earlier this year, Josh and the exceptional curator and thinker Chris Liu reached out with the aim of presenting programming on climate and mass migration at this museum. Prior to the speakers joining on stage, I'd like to provide some contextualization. When I first met Dr. Benjamin Strauss in the front row, he was presenting a visual narrative on the history of climate change as affected by emissions created by the global north. He is the CEO and chief scientist of Climate Central, a not-for-profit dedicated to the nonpartisan communication of climate science to the widespread public. Sea level research, maps, visualizations, and web tools developed by Ben and his team have generated thousands of appearances in media outlets and drawn millions of online engagers. Today, Ben will share a presentation on historic climate change with plenty of visuals and displacement and tell some ancient stories. He will discuss an overview of recent sea level science and offer projections for this century as to the more dramatic sea level rise that different levels of warming could and potentially will lock in. The next talk will be one of our personal heroes, Amali Tower, who is the founder and director of a nonprofit called Climate Refugees. An expert in refugee protection and displacement, Amali has worked with the UN Refugee Agency and the US Refugee Admissions Program while contributing to the World Economic Forum Expert Network and the Center for Climate and Security. She is widely recognized for her research on climate-induced displacement, which was recently presented at COP26. Today, Amali will speak on climate displacement on a global level and present a holistic picture of both slow onset and fast onset climate events and intersecting to force population displacements. She'll review contemporary gaps in knowledge, gaps in approach, representation and inclusion, and touch on border security versus human security, climate justice, and advocacy ahead. For the third and last speaker, we are exceptionally grateful to be joined today by David Wallace-Wells, a best-selling author and essayist who explores climate change, technology, and the future of the planet and how we live here on it. David is the author of the widely acclaimed book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, and is a columnist and staff writer at the New York Times. He previously served as a deputy editor at New York Magazine and the deputy editor of the Paris Review. David will speak today about how to live in and make sense of an age of emergency that is also an age of rapid normalization, and he'll define that term. He'll discuss the current deformations of the climate and of the environment and its cost to human flourishing in terms of air pollution, migration, economic growth, and how dramatic these shifts are likely to be in the coming decades. Thank you all for being here this afternoon and taking time to learn and talk together in the historic beginning of this series. Thank you to the Whitney Museum of American Art for supporting this series, and we'll begin with the thoughts and images of Dr. Benjamin Strauss. Please join me in welcoming Ben.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Thank you, Haley, for the introduction, and Megan for hosting us, and Josh for the really stimulating art. I'm very glad to be here today. So in December of 2015, I was in Paris, one of thousands of people there for the global climate talks on the side. And one day, as a treat for myself, because there were a lot of events on the side, I went to see the world premiere of a documentary by David Attenborough about the Great Barrier Reef. I was in Paris, by the way, to share projections and images around sea level rise, and I considered myself a pretty big expert. But a story in that documentary, and it was a side story, told in just a few minutes, really upended everything I thought I knew about the impact of sea level rise. And it launched me on a many-year quest, which continues to this day. And I'm here to share just a little bit of what I've learned. I'm also compiling it into a book. So I'd like to begin the talk with 3 stories. And the documentary introduced me to the first one. The Gamoy Walubara Yidinji people are an Aboriginal people who today live in Queensland, Australia, near the city of Cairns. Long ago, they lived near some cliffs at the shore. And in their story, which they tell to this day in an oral tradition, a man named Gunya hunted a sacred fish. And when he speared the fish became furious, and to punish Gunya and his people, the fish raised the oceans and drowned their home. So in fact, 14,000 years ago, or I'll say from around 15,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, in the world, the oceans did rise. They rose about 400 feet. 20,000 years ago was the depth of the last ice age. We would be here sitting under an ice sheet, near the edge of that ice sheet. Long Island is the mound of dirt that ice sheet pushed and left behind when it melted and retraced. And the planet naturally warmed, and the ice melted, and sea levels rose. And the area that is today the Great Barrier Reef used to be a coastal plain. Surely Aboriginal people lived there. In fact, there were cliffs right at the edge of that. And so this memory in the story of Gunya, through analysis of its details, it's a story that's between 10 and 14,000 years old. And that's what really got me. Because if you Google world's oldest story, the answer you get is Gilgamesh, which was written about 4,000 years ago. Okay? Here's a story that's probably 3 times older, remembered by one small group of people for perhaps 500 generations by word of mouth alone. What kind of trauma did they experience? How important was it to them to lose their homes that they made this story so important that they carried it all the way until today? I realized that I did not begin to understand the effect that losing home to the encroaching ocean could have on a culture. Here's a second story from Hindu mythology. Manu, who's a very formative figure, actually, in some traditions, a kind of father of humankind, and Manu is actually the etymological origin for the word man. Manu was good-hearted and took care of a small fish. And the fish, he helped it as it grew. Eventually, the fish became too big to live in the rivers and streams where Manu encountered it and went out to the ocean. But one day, the fish came back and found Manu at the shore and told him, "A great purifying flood is coming, but I will save you." And the fish rescued Manu as, again, the oceans rose and drowned the land. Third story, most familiar to most people here, I imagine, is the story of Noah from primeval Genesis. People became wicked, they sinned. God punished humanity, except for Noah, by bringing a great flood. So what do these stories have in common? Certainly a great flood, but also, I'll argue, sea level rise from the thawing of the Ice Age, the last Ice Age. In fact, and a little bit comfortingly, the ocean took a lot more land from our ancestors than it will ever take from us. The next slide helps to explain that. I've got a couple of science slides in here. So the Earth has, for millions of years, cycled naturally between ice ages and little warm intervals in between them. These 3 lines, the top line shows levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The line below that in red shows temperatures, tracking that rather nicely. And then beneath that, you see sea level rise. And in fact, this rhythm of an ice age every 100,000 years or so, or a warm interval every 100,000 years, right? This regular cycle is driven by natural rhythms of orbit, which caused small shifts in temperature, which in turn led carbon dioxide to increase and get in a vicious cycle of increasing carbon dioxide, leading to the vast majority of the temperature rise. So the last ice age, you can see here, led to about 400 feet of sea level rise. If you look at the bottom panel, or 120 meters, the thawing of that ice age. This diagram, by the way, is not yet showing the last 200 years. Right here you can see, again, 400 feet. So that's where we were at the start of the Industrial Revolution, and that spike, that natural spike in blue, is what our ancestors experienced. So 20,000 years ago, here's an illustration of a landmass. It's taken from the book. And I'm going to show you a bunch of maps like this. They're all science-based, but I'm working with an illustrator to draw them by hand, which pleases me more aesthetically. Maybe for a sprinkle of imagination and a sense of history. You can probably guess where this is. It was Gunya's home. And the next slide gives the context of today. So the light gray shows the difference that 400 feet of sea level rise made, the land that the ocean ate since the last ice age. And you'll see, not just near Cairns, but all around Australia, there was great loss. Note the rock art site. A lot was lost there. That will come back later in the talk. Here's another landmass 20,000 years ago. You can probably guess where, but the next slide will show the change. There are many stories besides Manu from the south and the north of India, indigenous stories, other stories in the Hindu tradition that echo a rising sea. One more place that you can probably guess where it is, and I'll reveal it. It's the Near East, the Arabian Peninsula. So Gunya and Manu's stories explicitly invoke the rising sea. But why would I imply a link between Noah and sea level rise? And why am I showing you the Persian Gulf specifically? I don't have proof of a connection, and I doubt anyone ever will. But there are some really intriguing plausibility arguments, and I'll share some of those here. First of all, imagine living in that once dry Persian Gulf plain. And imagine a wealthy man, perhaps a little eccentric, with a lot of stuff. And his grandfather lived at a time when the ocean was several days' walk away. His father lived at a time when the ocean was a day's walk away. And he watched the ocean approaching, decade by decade. I could imagine someone like that with a lot of stuff, maybe deciding to build an ark to put the stuff in, so that when the ocean inevitably arrived, he would just be able to float away with it and all his stuff. And intriguingly, through deeper research that I will not get into it, I have found geographies and time frames around 14,000 years ago in the Persian Gulf where many hundreds of square miles could have flooded from a rising ocean very rapidly, days or weeks. Now, the oldest written texts linkable to Noah, Gilgamesh, which has the same flood story in it essentially, were written 4,000 years ago, much more recently. But if the Gemoi Walubara Yidinjis could remember losing their home to sea level rise for 14,000 years, 10 to 14,000 years, why couldn't the Mesopotamians hold that story for thousands and thousands of years before they wrote it down? So, you're probably thinking, but what about the 40 days of rain? And the text does say that twice. And I agree, rain was probably involved also, both at the same time. But consider the exact text of, when the flood actually happens in Genesis 7:11. It says, the first words, all the fountains of the great deep burst apart, and the floodgates of the sky broke open. So, I think sea level rise and climate change are a part of Noah's story too. Now, the flood is the worst punishment in the whole Bible. But when it's over, God puts a rainbow in the sky as a sign of covenant, never to destroy humankind again. I see a loophole in that. God never promised that people wouldn't destroy themselves with a flood. Call it the rainbow loophole. And unfortunately, we're walking right through it. Going back to history for a moment, deep, deep history, and in this chart, I'm doubling from 400,000 years, that was in the last one, to 800,000 years, and looking at carbon dioxide only as measured directly from air bubbles in deep ice cores taken through Greenland and Antarctica. This graph again shows natural variation, and then we add what we've done recently there. The next slide will actually show the same thing, but more dramatically. As bad as this looks, it hides the true speed of change because it squeezes almost 1 million years into a few feet. So instead, you can show what was the change in carbon dioxide each 1,000 years. My colleague Scott Culp and I did this, and it produces this kind of change per 1,000 years graph. It produces what we call the carbon skyscraper. So that last spike is the last 1,000 years. It would look more dramatic if we made this a 100-year chart, but there's not enough density of data going back 800,000 years to really justify 100 years. But I can show you this. All the other lines were 1,000 years, and that was the last 100 years. Okay? So I think, to me, at least what goes up quickly can go down quickly. That's actually a very basic principle in lots of systems. Personally, I think climate change is the easiest hard problem compared to injustice, inequity, war, disease. It's very recent. Anthropogenic climate change I'm talking about now. And we know exactly how to solve it. Still hard, but we know what to do. That's the good news. Here's a look. So right, we're talking, and what, although we have there's only 200 feet of sea level rise left in all of the ice of the world. Our ancestors experienced 400 feet, but the difference is that speed of change, and of course, how densely settled we are with permanent, a tightly interlinked world with political instability and densely settled coastal areas. This is a look at recent sea level rise, looking at just the last 20 centuries. We've already done almost that much again in the 21st century, its first couple decades. But an important principle is that melting lags warming. We're just beginning here, right? So the big melt has begun again. Here's just one piece of photographic evidence for that. And we're already experiencing consequences in these very early days of sea level rise. For instance, in a first and foremost, sharp increase in the frequency of coastal floods, many of which can be attributed to human cause. Colleagues and I did a study of Hurricane Sandy, actually, and if you remove 4 inches or so that we could attribute, whoops, that just happened, to climate change, to human-caused sea level rise, there would have been $8 billion less damage, we estimate, and 71,000 people and 36,000 homes not affected. So it's here, right? It's here now already. Now I'm going to look forward a little. Here's a map looking forward. This is a very middle range scientific projection from the IPCC applied to a map for 100 years in the future. You can try and guess where this might be, and the next slide I'll reveal it as southern Louisiana. And you can also, I'm actually including New Orleans as that kind of lobe to the right, and I'm giving credit to all the levees that currently exist in this imagery, assuming that they will hold. Otherwise, New Orleans would not be in that lighter area. Here's another area I doubt anyone will guess, but I'll show you the 100-year. This is a 100-year projection of the of what's below water, and in the present context, you can see it's Bangkok becoming a peninsula. Surely this area is unguessable, but it's the capital of the territory of the United States, the Marshall Islands, Majuro. And actually, the president of the Marshall Islands played a major role in the negotiations for the Paris Agreement in 2015, and you can see why he was so deeply motivated. During the same Paris talks, there was this really powerful art installation in front of the Pantheon. The artist Olafur Eliasson had actually lassoed these icebergs off the coast of Greenland, tugged them to Copenhagen, and then bussed them to Paris and arranged them in front of the Pantheon in the shape of a clock and called it Ice Watch. And during the 2 weeks of talks, we all watched it slowly melting. And to me, the most profound thing about it is its illustration of this very simple fact that ice takes time to melt, right? We can put ice in a situation where we know it's going to melt. I just unplugged the freezer. It's full of ice. It doesn't melt like that. It takes time. The ice out in the world, in Greenland and Antarctica right now, it's just barely beginning to respond to the warming that we have already caused. And for each extra ton of carbon we put in the atmosphere, we're unplugging lots more freezers, right? So we're locking in future sea level rise. And we've done some science on that, so I'm going to show some images getting into what those projections are. Now we're talking, we don't have a time frame that's as clear as the earlier projections I showed. It's much easier to project how much the sea level will rise than how quickly. If I dumped a pile of ice on this stage, it would be very hard to tell you how many grams were melting per minute and when the pile would finish melting. But anyone with any degree or no degree in this room, we would all know it's all going to melt, how much is going to melt. So, but we make these choices of how much we lock in, right, this decade, right now, the coming couple decades. And I think it's little understood. I think kind of without thinking about it, we intuitively and innately assume that when we stop polluting, the problem will stop, right? If it ever gets bad, we'll just stop quickly and the problem will stop, but not so. It may stop getting worse, maybe. So here, for instance, is where we're looking, Buckingham Palace, present-day sea level. Next, I will show, next, I will show what's already locked in terms of sea level rise in our research, especially with a colleague, Anders Leverman from Germany. Now I move to 1.5. We seem to be, which is, we're about to probably cross 1.5 in the next few days. Now to 2, which is going to take a lot of hard work. This is probably the new global target to try and limit things to 2. We're more on a path of 3 degrees on our current policies and practices, but we could easily get to 4 if we're unlucky or we don't control pollution well. Now the next scene shows sea level at 4 degrees C in a nearby scene. See if you can guess it. It's a scientific projection. And here is what it is at 2 degrees. And here's a map showing what's locked in at 2 degrees, a multi-century projection. And it's the home of Buckingham Palace, London area. And I think most people will probably recognize where this is. Again, a 2 degree C map. And here, just to clarify, that's what's lost with that, probably new target of trying to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. This is multi-century, not happening this century, just to be clear. But still, not the legacy we really want to be leaving behind, is it? The next global climate talks this fall are happening in Dubai. This is Dubai after 3 degrees Celsius warming, our current path. And there it is if we hold things to 1.5. So all the Dubai and the Wall Street Bull images were made by hand with an artist that we've worked with over the years. Nikolai Lam is his name. Colleagues and I at Climate Central have worked with him. And we've seen tremendous responses to a couple of dozen images like this that we've made. But we've always wanted a way to scale that, to do a lot more. And now we've learned, we've just launched our flood vision technology. If you look in the window there, that reflection is our car driving by. And we're collecting data that, with its processing and with Psi, a little AI, produces an image like this, which corresponds to a very precisely controlled, right, scientifically accurate water level. So artists watching, please come to us at Climate Central with your ideas about what we can do with that, driving around, the whole US coast, right? Driving at scale to capture imagery of what different future projections might look like. So here are just a couple other examples coming out of the early days of our flood vision system. Now I'm going to skip to a totally different time frame. Gunya's flood happened 10,000 years ago plus, so I'm going to look forward 10,000 years into the future. And this came out of another paper led by Peter Clark at University of Oregon that about 20 of us collaborated on in the end. And we asked the question, what would happen if, looking at the fossil fuel reserves at the time, 2015, we left half in the ground and we burned half? Seems fair. These were the economically recoverable reserves that helped to provide the values of fossil fuel companies that were on the books, right? Their stock valuation based on their reserves. What if we just burn only half, and leave the other half in the ground? So after 10,000 years, this is a place you'll never guess. It's my favorite image. I call it the Grinch. You can't unsee that. But next slide will reveal where it is. It's a pretty hilly area. It's not a lot of loss, but that's San Francisco. You might recognize this. This is also the 10,000-year burn half, leave half projection. And I'll reveal it's a sizable chunk. Not blessed with San Francisco's topography. So, by the way, we are on a path to do much better than this, okay? But still, I don't want to be even close to it. And there's fresh exploration still going on for more, to discover more fossil fuel. If you're curious to explore more places, times, projection scenarios, everything I'm showing you comes from kind of online tools that you can find at climatecentral.org. Here's Atlantic City. And right here's a map of vulnerability of affordable housing. There's a lot you can explore there. And this is pointing to kind of some of the equity dimensions of climate impacts today that I think we're going to hear a lot more about from Amali next. So I'd like to go back to finish to our ancestors for some possible insights. Because I see three big ways that they responded to the rising ocean: migration, conflict, and innovation. So to start with migration, this was the place most affected in the ancient world. A whole subcontinent, an area the size of India, drowned under the ocean. And this subcontinent connected Southeast Asia to Indonesia. It was called Sundaland. It wasn't called that then, it's what geologists call it today. There is evidence from genetics, linguistics, and stories, oral traditions, which point to major emigration from Sundaland west as far as, to India and Mesopotamia, Sumer, east to Taiwan, and later even further. There is also evidence of displacement from the stories that are told. There are countless more stories, and this is a lot of the work I've been doing over recent years, countless more stories that echo ancient sea level rise beyond what I shared today, from all around the world. And a very common theme is the flood came and then we scattered. The flood came and then we scattered. So I would argue that coming back to the Bible, to Genesis, the Tower of Babel, it may also be a flood story. Because it's a story of scattering, and where does it occur? Right after Noah. Noah's flood, next story, Babel. Flood came, then we scattered. It's also an incredible allegory for modern climate change. It's the first industrial project in the Bible. Fired bricks, mortar made from fossil fuel, and what did we do? We got too high into the sky. We messed with the sky, God's domain, and we were punished by being scattered and given different languages. And it's now in that condition that we have to somehow cooperate to do something right for our one shared global atmosphere. More speculative, but quite intriguing, is to consider Eden. Because Adam and Eve were permanently expelled from their home, from paradise. And this story, along with the rest of the Bible, was written not long after 10,000 years, right? Twice the length of all of, quote, civilization, recorded history. There were 10,000 years of rising seas and displacement. So the book opens, we sin, we are banished from paradise, we lose that home forever. Unprovable. But there's additional intriguing, suggestive evidence I won't get to. Migration, number 2, comes conflict. So people had to migrate. Did it precipitate conflict? This is a note tongue. Oh, excuse me, that's my next slide. So these are mysterious, undated paintings in Australia, the second site I asked you to draw to. They were recently very ingeniously dated as 12,000 years, the heart of rapid rise. And to my eyes, we see clear conflict. So did people who fled their prime coastal homes coming inland get into conflict? It's easy to imagine. I am going to pass over the next story because I realize I'm taking a lot of time. But I'll just say, well, briefly, the people of Polynesia are gravely threatened with rising seas today and losing their homes. And there is evidence to suggest that they came from, a lot of people feel that they were settled from Taiwan. Polynesia was several thousand years ago. But before that, many refugees from Sundaland came to Taiwan. And to my thinking, what would better create skill and navigation in a maritime culture than watching your land turn into an island and your island slowly shrinking and your islands becoming farther and farther apart? Those people fled to Taiwan. Now they're in danger of losing their homes again in Polynesia, but they became the greatest ancient seafarers that there were. So innovation. Looking back, our ancestors lost much, suffered deeply, and wandered far. But at least we can also say enough of them also made it. I hope you can see that today we are part of a longer story. Humanity's oldest, widespread, fact-based story with climate change squarely in the center. Discovering this history and these stories, I have felt a growing connection to my ancestors and to peoples around the world. And these stories have more in common than dealing with rising seas. They also deal with values. In each story, people are punished for doing something wrong. Our ancestors' stories were powerful. They actually helped to shape or reinforce values at the cores of their cultures that lasted until today. But no matter what our ancestors did, they couldn't stop the flood. It was natural. Well, the situation is different for us. We are the cause, and we can slow the floods if we change. So finally, and more for us, not for them, the moral weight of the old stories does fall rightly on our shoulders. And I think we are going to need the power of stories to do the job, to help inspire and sustain the major effort that's required to stabilize the climate and to grapple with the effects that we have not avoided. Can we hear the wisdom of our ancient elders? Wisdom that has crossed hundreds of generations to reach us? It must be important if we held on to it that long. To catalyze change today, I believe we must both hear these stories and also tell ever more and better stories suited to today's time with words and with art. To me, this kind of sharing is an essential foundation for the scale of the effort that's needed. Climate change is in about 0.5% of the news today. People almost never discuss it, according to survey after survey. We have to change that. If we all tell enough stories well enough, I believe we can do something much bigger than the current path that we're on. More change is coming, but how much is up to us. There is no time for an escape rocket ship. This planet is our only home. Can we make it our ark? And what stories will our descendants tell about us? Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm going to just welcome Amali Tower up next. Oh, the break was going to be at 2:30. Amali, do you want to go? And then, yeah, let's do that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Let me just, okay, got an iPad here with my own notes. Okay, so thank you to the Whitney Museum. Thank you, Megan, Josh, Haley, and also Christopher Liu. Thank you so much for this honored invite. I'm really, really happy to be here with all of you and my fellow panelists to talk about what I think is a highly overlooked issue of climate displacement. I come to this work, I should say I'm not a scientist, I'm a humanitarian. I'm a human rights expert, always awkward to use that word. But I'm informed in this by lived and learned experience in refugee protection with the UN, US government, working all around the world. And it was while working in that context, especially in Africa, that I first heard refugees describe climate change effects as contributing to their displacement. Hearing those testimonies led to the founding of Climate Refugees in 2015. I had no intentions of founding an organization, but when I discovered this huge gap, which I'll be talking about, but also the lack of focused attention on this, that's really what led to the founding. So, and also that fundamentally, this is an issue of justice. And right now, all that we're really seeing is the very blatant injustice that is forcing people out of their homes. So there's absolutely no question that climate change is driving displacement right now in every corner of the world. No one is unaffected, but it is disproportionately happening to the world's poorest, oppressed, and marginalized people in the most precarious and fragile situations in the world. The displacement that we know most about, in terms of climate displacement that is, seems to be happening internally and disproportionately in the global south, so in the poorest places in the world. On average, climate change impacts displace about 23 million people every year. And we've been gathering that data since only about 2008. So just imagine how much really has been lost as well, right? In some years, climate change drives displacement 3 times more than even conflict or violence. For example, last year, as you see here, the number was 32.6 million. That was, again, well over 3 times the conflict displacement. And in 2020, it was 30.7 million. As you can see, the displacement last year was the highest in a decade, which amounts to about 41% highest than the annual average of the past 10 years. Now, globally, every year, we're going in the wrong direction again. Today, nearly 110 million people are forcibly displaced due to conflict, persecution, violence, economic inequality, and disastrously climate change. Now, let's put 110 million people into perspective, because data is just data. You need to recognize that these are human beings and these are human impacts, and we need to talk about this issue in that light. Let's hope I do this correctly. So I've gathered some pictures here of all the places in which I've worked. If all the world's forcibly displaced people, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, that constitutes over 1.4% of the global population, or the 14th most populous country in the world. The injustice of this is that those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are paying its heaviest price. 80% of refugees and 70% of internally displaced people come from the world's most fragile countries. Now, these are developing countries, once colonized, now on the front lines of the climate crisis. Somalia, which has a carbon footprint of almost 0, is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. Drought, floods, erosion are just some of the heavy impacts it's dealing with today. Over 75% of all new displacement in Somalia today is climate driven. Over 1.4 million people have now been displaced by the worst drought and famine the Horn of Africa has ever experienced, which climate scientists say that Ben's good work has done as well, would not have happened without human-induced climate change. Climate displacement is, whoops, I did this wrong. I'm gonna use a trackpad. Give me just 1 second, friends. Oh, I know what I've done wrong here. I'm so sorry. Okay. So let me just get you to the developed countries in the global north. Okay, so climate displacement is happening in developed countries as well, okay? And I want to sort of pause here on Miami. This is Miami's Little Haiti neighborhood, which is a neighborhood comprised of Haitian refugees, newly arrived immigrants, Central Americans who are fleeing climate displacement, and historically marginalized Black American citizens. Historically marginalized, why? From 1960s racist redlining policies. It's also Miami's highest elevation point, and I'm sure it's not going to surprise anyone that this is one of the many areas that rich coastal communities are now eyeing for climate relocation. If Miami were a country, it would be the fourth most vulnerable to rising sea levels. So it's not just Somalia and the global south countries that I've shown you, it's the marginalized populations right here at home that are on the front lines of this. You'll note once again then it's poor and people of color in our communities that are at risk to both climate change and its intersecting impacts. Now, in Miami as also, Liberty City is an almost exclusively Black neighborhood and is going through the same struggles of what is being described as climate gentrification. Even middle-income communities in the US and Europe are starting to see heavy impacts with insurance gaps and losses which increasingly can't be sustained, potentially creating unpaid losses that could push further people into poverty. The latest US Census data reveals 3.4 million Americans were displaced by disasters in 2022, while nearly 40% of individuals returned home within a week of evacuating. Roughly 12% were out of their homes for more than 6 months, and 16% have never returned home. That's right here in the US. The data also highlights higher evacuation rates for the lowest income households, LGBTQ individuals, and Black and Hispanic residents, once again demonstrating the intersecting impacts of this injustice. Now, let me make sure I'm using this clicker correctly. A major challenge of information and political will is how little we are documenting the full scope of climate displacement. The climate crisis fuels displacement within and across borders in multiple ways, through sudden events like disasters and slow effects like droughts, famines, rising seas, all of which lead to loss of livelihood, shrinking economic opportunities, and poverty. But in terms of climate displacement numbers, there is a tendency to focus on one type at a time, mostly only internal disaster displacement. So we're missing the whole picture of where climate displacement fits into the larger global picture of forced displacement. For instance, we're missing how slow climate impacts like drought, desertification, the salinization of waters are driving displacement as well, both internally and also across borders. We're missing gathering whether disasters like the cyclones and the hurricanes are also driving displacement across borders. And we're missing how climate is intersecting with vulnerabilities like Ben was talking about, of conflict, poverty, which is being exacerbated by climate change, that actually then push people out of their homes. So our current siloed approach is certainly not the whole picture, and it runs the risk of perpetuating gaps in data, understanding, and effective response for the most vulnerable people on the planet. Now, quite a lot of this has to do with our current global refugee system, which is informed from World War II, and which is designed, quite frankly, to be reductive towards who is worthy of protection. It limits our understanding and response basically to only show up for people who are displaced across borders by conflict or persecution along these 5 grounds that you see here. In 1951, this convention had both a geographic limitation and a time limitation. It was only meant to apply to people fleeing Europe, and it was seriously not meant to last this long. But in 1967, with, surprise, surprise, the breakdown of colonial pasts and new states forming, new conflicts also broke out, creating non-European refugee flows. And I would personally say that powerful global North countries, knowing fully well that refugees tend to flee to neighboring countries, there was a strategic need to expand the convention to apply to everybody for self-interested reasons. And so we have the 1967 Additional Protocol. And would it surprise any of you to know that today, 80% of that 110 million people I was talking about, 80% of that population lives in the global south. That's not an accident. This is by design, by very powerful people, right? Which we're all a part of. So simply put, to be clear, Who is a refugee? A refugee is someone who has left their country and is seeking protection in another country of which they are not a citizen due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And that's it. That is the current governance framework for refugees, for migration, for anybody who is in need of international protection. So you can see that this is a highly narrow and limited definition that does not adequately reflect the dynamics of today's global displacement. Is it any wonder then that so many are uncounted and so many are shut out? Of the 110 million people I mentioned, only 35 million have the legal protective status of refugee. 35 million. So then the vast majority remain asylum seekers and internally displaced persons within some of the poorest and most climate vulnerable countries in the world. So how is a country that is on the front lines of the climate crisis supposed to deal with a population that is actually experiencing setbacks in development, in the basic right to education, in a basic sustainability in terms of like a livelihood, a livable wage? And these are countries who've contributed almost nothing to climate change. Now, the system and a lack of political will actually limits our intent to even gather concrete data on the number of cross-border climate displacements. So much so that our newly appointed UN Special Rapporteur, Ian Fry, for Human Rights and Climate Change, has even pointed to the reluctance of UN actors to make a total assessment of the number of persons displaced internationally as a consequence of climate change. It may not seem like it much to you all, but in terms of international global diplomacy, it is hugely significant that a human rights expert is calling out the UN agencies who do the work of UN member states, like the United States, right? And it can only move at the will of political will. So this is hugely significant and a step in the right direction. The world's climate scientists warned us as early as 1990 that migration would be one of the biggest forced outcomes of climate change. Now, I've spoken to people in North Africa, Central America, the Horn of Africa, Africa's Sahel, where temperatures are warming 1.5 times faster than anywhere else in the world. And some have told me about their earliest displacement in the 1970s. Now, yes, that's me. You might think I'm standing on sand dunes here, but I'm actually standing on the memories, on the celebrations, on the homes, on the cultural loss, on the deaths, and on the full lives of people who once lived here in this North African village. I mean, just pause and think about that for a second. That's not a sand dune. This is what desertification looks like. Ravaged by desertification, the handful of holdouts still living in this abandoned village, overrun by encroaching deserts, told me people started leaving here as early as 1983. And in this next picture, in Africa's Lake Chad Basin in the Sahel, refugees displaced by war told me their displacement was climate-driven when the lake started drying up. As early as 1973 was the first displacement that I was able to document. And yet here we are, just barely beginning to talk about this in the full scope it deserves in 2023. Now, for many frontline communities, this is the third point I want to talk about. For many frontline communities, migration then, when you look at those sand dunes, is it a bold statement for me to say that migration is a means of adaptation for people who live in places that are now untenable? But increasingly too, right, it's a coping mechanism in the absence of climate adaptation support. But for the rich, for the powerful, for developed countries, of the world who are the most responsible for the climate crisis, keeping people out is the priority. Let me just do this right here. I might be having audiovisual problems. Yeah, it's not advancing. Maybe this isn't working?
Seems like it's not working.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. Okay. That's really a shame because I really want, this slide is full of videos of the most immense border walls, surveillance technologies, drones, and what it looks like when you're on the other side of that. I'll try to get it to play because I really want you all to see this because people don't see it, right? These are the things governments do with your taxpayer dollars and don't want you to see. So, for the rich, powerful, developed countries of the world who are the most responsible for the climate crisis, keeping people out is a priority, and you could even say a tool of their climate policy. Knowing fully well that climate change is driving displacement across borders today. That wall behind there, that is the border of San Diego and Tijuana in Mexico. There's even a wall that goes right into the ocean. It's not uncommon for families to put their outstretched arms through the fence, and that's the only way in which they've seen each other for multiple decades. I would encourage you all to go to this beach in San Diego, to go to Friendship Park, and to see how we demean people on a daily basis. This is just one of the many borders I could have shown you. Now, since 2008, we've known about the tens of millions of climate-displaced people every year, where in some years I said that displacement is 3 times more than conflict and violence. Now, during this time, instead of helping developing countries adapt to climate change, the world's richest and most powerful countries have constructed racialized borders, built walls, deployed surveillance technologies, and hired border guards from Mexico to the Mediterranean, decidedly to keep people out. The Mediterranean boat tragedy in Greece last month that I hope you all remember or followed because it was widely overshadowed by a submersible of 5 billionaires looking for Titanic treasure. Would it surprise anybody to know that over 600 brown and black people drowned in the Mediterranean last month? In an example of border pushbacks that kill people, were vulnerable climate populations like the Pakistanis, who died, who are also fleeing the effects of last year's disastrous flooding that submerged 1/3 of the country in water, killed and injured over 15,000 people, and displaced 8 million people. One disaster. And all climate scientists have come out and said, that disaster was like on steroids because of human-induced climate change. 8 million people. To date, in the Mediterranean alone, border security has led to the death of over 26,000 people who have drowned under the European Union's watch. A number we know is woefully lower than actual deaths. Now, meanwhile, this is all happening. Instead of providing the $100 billion annually in climate adaptation funding and support that rich, global polluting countries promised in 2009, they've continued unfettered wealth accumulation at the expense of the global south, increased their emissions, and increased spending on militarizing their borders. For the US, UK, Europe, Australia, and other historic global polluters, border militarization is climate policy. So much so that their border security spending in the billions is collectively more than 2 times higher than their climate finance. Even when there are refugee protection overlaps, countries are reticent to provide refugee protection for people displaced by conflict, and they're even less likely to provide protections in climate contexts. I think it's incredibly important that we realize that nobody wants to be forced to leave their home, and yet millions are forced to leave every year, only to be met by border guards, walls, jails, and forced returns. Or as you would have seen in a video that I would have played you, across from California's borders, there are thousands of people living on the streets in makeshift camps. And I've been to just about, all the major refugee camps in the world. And the things happening across from the border from Texas and California are some of the worst camps I've ever seen in the world, and some of the most abysmal humanitarian conditions that are happening right now under our watch. So where do we go from here? I'm not going to sugarcoat how bad it is, but as Ben was saying, there are things we can do, and they take an act of democracy. They take us all getting involved. Well, I think the first thing we have to realize is that the climate crisis is a colonial crisis. We have a crisis created by a handful of global north countries and about 100 corporations whose continuous actions threaten to hold the world hostage to a system that is deeply flawed. Our multiple climate, migrant, and refugee crises are perpetuated by some of the very systemic failures instituted by these countries. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC that you heard Ben refer to, now even acknowledges the role of colonialism in the climate crisis, calling for systemic change in economic policies and capital markets that widen inequality, poverty, and base the global economy on the burning of fossil fuels. So we have to be fearless about challenging these failed systems. Now, we've been doing everything we can to uplift storytelling, testimonies, submissions, reporting on exactly all these things that I'm talking about. Traveling to speak to affected populations, some of which you've seen, not only to gather their testimonies and experiences, but to facilitate representation and their inclusion, which is completely lacking in informing the policies that are meant to protect them. That means also speaking to people who are trapped as well, because migration is costly and closed to most vulnerable people. This work, I would say, has led to the greatest development that I've seen to date, which I'm stunned and surprised and overjoyed about, which just happened last month, a couple of weeks ago. This is Ian Fry. Oh, well, it'll be the next slide. Ian Fry is the newly appointed UN Climate Change and Human Rights Special Rapporteur. Ian is a longtime climate advocate. His appointment is the result of 30 years of advocacy from small island states and developing countries. And no sooner than he is appointed, he made climate displacement top priority on his agenda and has now released a report calling for the UN and UN member states to adopt a new legal instrument to protect climate refugees. Now, if refugee law from 1951 has been about not expanding this because countries are reticent to even abide by what the convention upholds, imagine what a revolutionary idea it is for the UN Special Rapporteur to come out and say, hold the phone, we need an entirely new legal instrument. It's massive, and it speaks to the climate tipping points. Let's hope this next video plays. I wasn't planning to play it, but the Whitney very graciously embedded this for me. So.
The human rights implication of climate change displacement, in particular for persons displaced across international borders due to climate change, are significant and disturbing. People displaced by climate change face multiple violations of their human rights. The climate change event may deprive people of their right to food, water, sanitation, housing, health, education, and for some, their right to life. Studies suggest that women and children are the most affected by disasters and the effects of climate change, as they are up to 14 times more likely to be killed than men by climate disasters such as hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, or floods. It is now time for the international community to realise responsibility to protect people displaced across international borders due to climate change. Also, the level of protection given to people displaced across international borders is haphazard and signifies a general lack of uniformity at the international level. It is vitally important that we give full protection to people displaced across international borders to climate change.
So that's Ian Fry, someone I'm deeply grateful to have in this work now. And you know, as Josh's exhibit is on personal responsibility, I mean, doesn't that video speak to you about where the responsibilities lie? This is about state responsibility. This is about governments that are complicit and responsible, stepping up for the most vulnerable, oppressed people who are victims and are being forced to be survivors on this planet. This is exactly what's going on. And you know, it's not lost on me that it's powerful when a white man says that. So that's an extra blessing. Now, this is work that obviously we couldn't welcome more. And we've actively lobbied for these very protections, realizing that our refugee governance framework excludes millions of people in need. We've engaged with the Special Rapporteur, providing context and testimonies, storytelling from displaced populations, encompassing solutions grounded in human rights that safeguard the universal right to migrate and also the right to stay in your home. What governments need to realize is this: people do not put their lives and their children's lives at risk for a better job. People today are fleeing situations that are distressing, that are traumatizing, that are untenable for any kind of stable life, and they're being met with indignity, hostility, and even death. And I'm happy to say that some governments are beginning to realize they can no longer ignore the huge protection oversight. The US is hopefully one of those countries that is now turning the corner. When President Biden issued an executive order wanting to better understand the effects of climate change on migration in February 2021, I worked around the clock like a madwoman, providing the administration this report to help inform US policy. And for over 2 years, it's been sidelined. Afghanistan happened, Ukraine happened, COVID has happened, right? Or the economic impacts of COVID, and it's been completely sidelined. And just as I'd given up hope, the wait all of a sudden is over. And just 3 weeks ago, the US State Department announced its intention to incorporate climate migration into its migration and refugee policy. Now, the proof will be in the details and in the implementation. And I can assure you we will be watching, and we will continue to work with the administration, because that's the kind of engagement it's going to take. It's going to take all of us. Now, to wrap up, on a global scale, what can we do? Well, there's the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, the COP process. Ben was talking about COP21 in Paris. We have COP28 coming up in Dubai. On the global stage, 30 plus years in the making, the long, hard, justice work of seeking climate reparations is finally coming to light under the UN climate policy of loss and damage. We're working on advancing this policy too, contributing evidence of loss and damage from the Lake Chad Basin, like this one 2 years ago at COP26, that is informed by people's impacts, their stories, their storytelling, their human rights losses. You don't need to hear from me. You need to hear from the affected populations. And we're contributing many other reports, case studies. There will be more forthcoming from Kenya, from Somalia, from Central America, also from Miami. And the whole idea is to advance human rights protections and climate finance where it's vitally needed. Now, as I wind up here, I've tried to give you a snapshot today of just a few of the world's increasing climate crises in a time of compounding global crises when existing sources of finance, including insurance, humanitarian aid, development aid, are painfully inadequate to deal with the severe setbacks that are pushing millions more into poverty and the huge losses and damage from climate events. Clearly, we need better systems. I would say we also need new legal structures. We need fairer economic systems. We need new international financial instruments other than the World Bank and the IMF. We need new sources of funding that ensure both the protection of people who are forcibly displaced and the protection of people who have a right to stay. More and more, we live in times where people are not afforded that choice. Clearly, we need political will that underpins all actions. We need that political will to do better, and the call for bold leadership and the necessary systemic change we need must be informed by affected populations and demanded by us all. It is my fervent hope that you will be one of those people. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to a conversation.
Amali, that was incredible. Ben, also incredible. So we had planned to take a 10-minute break. We thought you all deserved to stretch your legs, use the restroom, because this has been gripping, and I know I haven't wanted to miss a minute. So let's do that, but we will begin again at 2:55. So thank you so much for being here. Don't leave. Come back and hear David speak and hear the conversation to come. For coming back. Thank you for those who are watching online. So I'm going to just turn it over to David Wallace-Wells, and then we'll go straight into the conversation.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. Before I really get into my notes, just wanted to echo everything that it's been said by all the other speakers about the privilege of being here, having this kind of a conversation, this kind of watershed event for an American museum, and to be doing it as part of Josh's show is a special privilege and excitement for me. So just really glad to be speaking with all of you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation as it goes forward and becomes an actual conversation. I wanted to start just by saying that, when we think about climate change, we're often reflexively projecting deep into the future. Amali's talk was focused on the present, but I think most of our energies, our imaginative energies, pull us decades down the line to landscapes and worlds that we have a hard time connecting to our own. They feel so different, so fundamentally reordered from the world that we inhabit today. Some of them look apocalyptic, some of them look merely degraded, some of them just discombobulated. And all of those stories are true. Climate change is going to change the world in all of those ways. Even in a kind of a best case scenario where we limit warming to about 2 degrees, we're probably going to see something like 150 million people dying of air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. We're likely to see flooding events that used to hit once a century and create whole local mythologies arriving every year, in some places more than once a year. We're going to see cities in South Asia and the Middle East in particular that are today home to 10 or 12 or 15 million people being so hot. During summer, it'll be difficult to work outside, sometimes even difficult to move outside without risking heat stroke and even heat death. So we're talking about a totally reordered world. But I actually want to talk today not about that future, not about that dark future. I want to talk today about the present, because I think it tells us something very important about what's to come. The path towards climate apocalypse is paved by climate disruption, but also by adaptation and human response, on the one hand, and on the other hand, by normalization at all levels, from the individual to the community, to the social and political and geopolitical. Now, what do I mean by normalization? One way, I work at the New York Times, one way of thinking of normalization is like when 100,000 Americans died of COVID, the New York Times had a banner headline across all 6 columns, named every single person. We're now at 11, 12 times as many deaths, and we've all moved on. That is normalization. And it is normalization at sort of warp speed. But we're doing a lot of that already with climate change and its disruptions. And I think we sometimes fall into a trap when we imagine that the dramatic transformations of our world are only going to be visited upon our children and our grandchildren, and to some degree that allows us to avoid looking squarely at the disruptions and changes that we're looking at, that are happening in the world today, which is problematic because we're likely to deal with those even scarier futures in part by defining them as normal too, rather than responding to them with a kind of moral outrage and human empathy and sympathy that we really should. So to talk about where we are today, and the present tense of climate change. I mean, one way of thinking about this and talking about it is to say literally where we are today. We are at the Whitney. We are in a well air-conditioned room. It's a balmy day outside. It's Sunday, but we're all gathered here. You know, this is maybe a step out of our normal routines to be spending a few hours thinking about climate change. But it's also normal for most of us to be living the ways that we're living today. Even though, you know, last week we had the 4 hottest days ever recorded in modern history on planet Earth. That, of course, is no surprise since we are now warmer than we have ever been in the entire history of human civilization. We're at about 1.2, 1.3 degrees of warming, as a couple of the other speakers have mentioned. That puts us already entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history, which means that no human has ever walked on a planet as warm as the one that we're walking on today. And it means that everything that we've ever known as human civilization is in part the result of climate conditions that we have now totally and probably forever left behind. That goes for the geography that we know, but it also goes for the politics that we know, the agriculture that we know, the culture that we know. Everything that we've ever done as a species is a result of a different climate system than the one that we will be living in forever after. And where that leaves us is in a landscape that it is really hard when you stare clearly at the data to see as normal, and yet our impulse of normalization is so strong that we see it that way anyway. In Canada, more than 5 times as much land has burned this year, just about a month or two into fire season, than burned in the record-setting California fire season of 2020, when half of all air pollution in the western US came from the burning of forests. It's to say, as much particulate matter was breathed in by Westerners in the US from the burning of forests than from all other human and industrial activity combined. That was in 2020. Canada has burned 5 times as much land as in that year. In Quebec, a single province, in the first 20 days of June, more land burned than burned in the last 25 years in Quebec combined. And that air pollution that's produced that we are now somewhat familiar with in New York and all across the eastern US is a public health threat that should shadow and dominate our sense of global well-being and human flourishing at the moment in ways that it's almost hard for us to wrap our heads around. Wildfire pollution is not the main driver of air pollution globally. That's the burning of fossil fuels. But most estimates suggest that at least 5 million and probably as many as 10 million people every single year are dying from the burning of fossil fuels. That's death at the scale of a Holocaust every single year. It's so significant that across parts of South Asia, in particular parts of India, you have whole regions where people are losing 10 years of their life expectancy because of particulate pollution. That's true in Delhi. Every single resident of Delhi, every single resident, it's a city of like 14 million people, every single resident is living 9 years less on average than they would without air pollution. Now, this is like a humanitarian horror. It's tied up in climate change. It tells us to some degree the damage that we're doing with climate change, but it's also a little bit mind-bending in the sense that the human health toll of climate change, of air pollution, is probably larger than we're going to see, certainly over the next few decades, from all the other impacts of climate change combined. That's what it means for 10 million people to be dying every year. Climate change does kill, it also does displace and cause huge amounts of suffering, but at the level of mortality, we are seeing more people dying from fossil fuel pollution today than we're going to be seeing dying from direct climate impacts over any time scale that makes sense for us to really plan for. And yet we're not paying nearly enough or as much attention to it. We have already baked in our understanding of that suffering, treated it as a kind of a baseline, even as we're getting more and more scared about what the future of climate change will bring. And when I think about these dynamics about the transformations of the present and how they compare to the transformations of the future, I think about air pollution. I think about that mind-bending fact that we are now living through disaster and suffering and mortality that is larger than what we're likely to see from other climate impacts going forward, and larger than we're likely to see from fossil fuel pollution, because that's probably going down. But I actually think more about the recent history of 500-year storms. This is a phrase that has lost a lot of meaning in the time of climate change, but it's useful to remind us where our expectations used to be anchored, because these were storms that we used to believe would have about a 1 in 500 chance of hitting in any given year, which means probably we'd see them on average once every 500 years. 500 years is an extremely long time. 500 years ago, Europeans had barely landed in the Americas. Hernando Cortez had just made landfall in Mexico. So we're talking about a storm that we would expect to hit once during that entire history. The arrival of Europeans in the New World, waging of a genocide against the native people, building of colonies, the waging of a revolution, the building of a slave empire, a civil war, emancipation, the conquest of the entire country, the Industrial Revolution, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the age of the American Empire, the end of history and the end of the Cold War, September 11th, the financial crisis, COVID-19. We're talking about a storm we'd expect to hit once during that entire history. And Houston has been hit by 5 of them in 5 years. So we're literally seeing already today, literally, millennia of extreme weather concentrated in the space of half a decade. At the same time, Houston is still standing, and Australia is still functioning. And even though they've had temperatures across South Asia and India that approach what we believe to be the maximum human limit for survival, those civilizations are still enduring as well, which is a reminder that climate change, while unbelievably significant, is not the whole of our destiny. It just forms the natural landscape on which our future will be built. And when I think in optimistic terms about that future and that fate, I think about social political response. I think about the way that climate change teaches us about our common humanity and what we owe one another. I think about possible technological progress and the rates of change that are coming there as well. But I really worry about that future being built in part by our impulse of normalization, which I think is really, really strong. In fact, in many ways stronger than our impulse towards repair and response, even than our impulse towards fear and panic. And I say that because, for instance, thinking about the flooding in Pakistan that we saw last year, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So this was flooding, as was mentioned, drowned possibly a third of the whole country, created tens of thousands of deaths in migrants and refugees, also created conditions for incredible spread of disease because of all the stagnant water and the way that vector-borne diseases reproduce there. And in Pakistan, which is a country that is responsible in its entire history for as much carbon emissions as the US produces every single year. And those inequalities, that show the differences between what a country like the US is responsible for, what a country like Pakistan is responsible for, and the inequality between the impacts that a country like Pakistan suffers and a country like the US, which does suffer impacts, but nevertheless suffers, are so glaring, it can be really hard to look directly at them. In Nigeria, the average resident of Nigeria, which is not a poor country by African standards, the average resident of Nigeria produces only as much carbon as the average American refrigerator. And the average resident of Mali, which is a poor country, produces only as much carbon as the average British tea kettle does in a year. The entire continent of Africa, 800 million people, is responsible, depending on the estimate, for between 1% and 3% of historical emissions. And in the wealthy West, we look at suffering in those places, and we don't think we did that, and we don't think we need to help. We think predominantly that suffering is natural. We think of it as a feature of an economic and political system that benefits us, but because it benefits us, we have a hard time seeing it as created and imposed, which is what it was. And the costs are not just, the inequalities are not just measurable in terms of carbon emissions. Across much of Africa, many of those countries, it's been estimated, have lost as much as 20% of their economic growth over recent decades because of climate change, which means they are already today 20 to 30% poorer than they would be in a world without climate change. These are not people who can spare 20 to 30% of their wealth. And projections for the rest of the century, depending on how bad things could get, mean that many of them could end up in a situation towards the end of the century, especially in high emission scenarios, where the entire possibility of future economic growth has been stripped away from them. When I first began writing about climate, I often said it was important to look sort of distantly into the future, because so many of us anchored our understanding of the world on the present, and when we looked out our windows, we thought whatever world we were living in was normal, and it was useful to look farther into the future to really shake our sense of complacency that came from that daily normalization. But now I tend to think that, the problem of normalization is less about the way that we normalize our own experiences in the world and our own experience of even a totally distended and disrupted climate, and much more about how we normalize the suffering of people living in distant places, who we may choose to see as, fundamentally less human or less deserving of the protections that we offer ourselves. That's just one of the deforming ways that makes that climate normalization will work, or is already working on us. It's probably the grossest, the most uncomfortable, and also the most important to overcome. But it's not the only thing that will be going on as we continue to psychologically, emotionally, politically, socially adapt to a world that's changing very, very quickly. And I want to just talk through a few of those other transformations, in part because of the context of this, which is, we're in a museum space, this is an intellectual discourse. I want to think a little bit and ask you to think a little bit about all the ways in which climate is changing the way that we conceptualize the world and our place in it. And I hope you'll forgive me if this part of the talk is a little bit scattered. It's kind of meant to be, since the point is that a lot of our inherited models of explaining and thinking about the world are at least undermined and in a lot of ways contradicted or destroyed by the force of climate change. So to take one personal example of that, the idea of progress. I'm a relatively well-off white male American who came of age mostly in the 1990s. I was born in 1982. And even though I knew at the time in the 1990s that, there was a lot of self-mythologizing in that period of kind of imperial American might, I also was given to understand as sort of a kind of a birthright that the future would be better than the past. Not just that we would be richer, although that too, but that also the world would be more just and more connected, These were the stories that we told ourselves about what was happening in the aftermath of the Cold War and the way that the future would unfold. It was like, you know, in 2070, there were still going to be problems, but there were going to be different, smaller problems than the problems that we were facing in 1995 or whatever. I was a sophisticated enough person to doubt those myths, but I still think I really did imbibe them and consume them. And on some level, they do form kind of the basic architecture of the way that I think about the world. But it's really hard to think in those terms any longer, not just because of climate change, although climate change is one big part of it. And that's not to say that progress is impossible, or that the world of 2070 must be less just or much less prosperous than the world that we live in today or the world we lived in 20 years ago. I think actually there's a decent chance that it will be better in many measurable respects. It's to say that we can't just draw these simple lines from the past to the future, showing like GDP going up or global infant mortality going down and say, well, we did good. Because the most important way that we all measure progress, I think I've learned at least thinking about climate change over the last few years, is not against the past, but against what is possible, what was possible, what paths of better human flourishing were abandoned along the way, and by comparison to one another around the world, which is to say that inequality is a huge factor in the way that we see and judge human progress. Another disorientation is to knowledge and human certainty. You think about the record-setting heat events that we've seen. I'm talking about normalization. Like in El Paso, they have not had a day that was below 100 degrees for like 6 weeks. Or, you know, across South Asia and China, they've had record-setting heat now for months too, but we sort of stopped writing articles about them because, like, we wrote all those articles last year. Didn't everybody read them? Probably many thousands of dead as a result of direct exposure to heat. And you may have seen or may not have seen, there's been a lot of worry in the scientific community over the last 6 or 8 weeks about these record ocean temperatures, which have something to do with, wheezy, but it's something to do with the coming of El Nino in the Pacific, but also are just showing, like, by every measure in the North Atlantic, global sea temperatures in the Antarctic, in the Arctic, were like totally off the charts of all recent historical experience. Which again, you know, shouldn't be such a surprise because the ocean absorbs 91% of all heat produced by global warming, which is to say that the ocean's going to record 9 times as much transformation as land. But these changes that we've seen in the oceans are so off the charts. They're all so the temperatures are so different from what we've seen even just in the last few years that a lot of people are not really sure what is explaining them. And there's been a lot of debate among scientists about whether it's a simple prediction of climate change, whether there's effect from the arrival of El Nino, the effect of Saharan dust blowing in from Africa, which there's been very little Saharan dust. This is like very wheezy, but I'm just trying. We instituted new shipping rules a couple of years ago that reduced sulfur emissions, and that has an effect on global. There's been this huge debate, and the reason there's a debate is because scientists don't know exactly what is going on. And that is disorienting, and we will continue to be disoriented by phenomena like this going forward, because in the recent past, we've looked at climate models and predictions as a kind of a roadmap to the messy future that we're living in, the best roadmap that we have to that messy future. But the further we get into it, the deeper we get into it, the more surprises we see, the more confusion there is. There's something very basic going on where, as much as climate change is revealing to us each month and each year, it's also revealing to us how much our understanding of the future has been shadowed by uncertainty, and how much more we need to project that uncertainty forward in thinking about what to do to protect one another on that new world. And that uncertainty isn't just about particular impacts, it's also about temperature levels. There's been a lot of progress made over the last couple of years. We think probably we're pulling our global temperature rise this century down from what was expected, about 4 or 5 degrees, to something more like 3 degrees, which isn't nearly enough, but it's still significant progress. But we also don't know That if we produce the emissions that we expect to produce 3 degrees, whether it will still actually produce 3 degrees, or whether the climate system is going to surprise us and actually give us 4 degrees at that level, or 4.5 or 5 degrees. We have because climate science is science, we carry it with a false sense of certainty. And I think one of the things the next couple of decades will show us, if the present hasn't already, is how vain that certainty really is. It's going to change our sense of geography, not just by redrawing our coastlines and wiping the planet of all its glaciers, but in thinking about the transformations in different terms, in different ways. A few years ago, Americans just started worrying about wildfire smoke as a public health threat. Even a year or two ago, I heard from people on the East Coast, and I felt the same way. Well, like, thank God I don't live in California. I don't have to deal with worrying about smoke. And what happened this summer in New York is not a freak event there. 60% of all particulate pollution from wildfire in the American West travels outside the state in which it was produced. And as we've seen in recent weeks, it can also travel outside the country. It can even travel across oceans. Wildfire smoke from Canada is now affecting Europe. That happened with the bushfires in Australia a few years ago, where the smoke was so intense that Sydney Harbor was choked. Ferries couldn't run. Fire alarms in office buildings were going off because the only way that those alarms were able to make sense of the density of the smoke was by registering it as a fire. But the smoke traveled across to New Zealand, across to South America, and then across the Atlantic as well. We're going to be seeing these kind of mesmerizing shifts in the way that we think about geography, I think, much more often going forward. And that doesn't just go for air pollution. It goes for things like carbon removal, which is, in theory, an appealing prospect, the ways that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere. But I was just reading a report yesterday about how one way of doing that, which is to make some changes to ocean chemistry, it's a risky sort of envelope-pushing proposal, but it's something that people are talking about, would so distort the local fish populations that if a country were to do that, and in theory do it out of goodwill to try to remove some carbon from the planet's carbon burden, it could totally disrupt the diet patterns of neighboring countries. As we've been talking about today, there are a lot of these issues around migration and citizenship, what we owe one another, whether we owe the people whose suffering we've helped cause some additional degree of humanity than we seem to be affording them today. And it'll also transform and disorient our understanding of nature. We only really started seeing nature as a category, as a conceptual category, when it started to be under threat. It sort of was like invented alongside the Industrial Revolution because we started to see ourselves as living outside of it and then seeing nature as imperiled. When people truly lived in nature, we didn't call it nature, we just called it the world. But over the last few hundred years, and perhaps especially over the last couple of decades, nature's come to play a very particular role in our culture, not just on the environmental left. It's a shaming force, showing us our own destructiveness, but it's also a source of spiritual solace, a reminder of human humility, and of the eternal features of the world and the experience of being alive. It's almost like a psychedelic, and in fact, a lot of people like to do psychedelics in nature. We kind of like go on retreats to nature. We travel to nature. We recenter ourselves there before returning to the human world. This is kind of a vision of nature as a counselor, as a guru, as a shaman. But pretty soon, I think, we're going to have to start seeing nature, if we haven't already, in some more complicated ways. That's because in the meta-narrative of climate change, it's likely to become, at least in certain parts of the world, no longer an aid in our fight against warming, but a force fighting for the enemy. You can see that, for instance, in the way that the deforestation of the Amazon is bringing the possibility forward that as soon as a couple of decades from now, the Amazon, which is today the world's largest source of carbon from land, could actually be contributing, oxygen from land could be contributing more carbon to the atmosphere than it's absorbing. There's also going to be an effect on our understanding of time. Since the beginning of industrialization, we've, in the West at least, built a model of linear time based on the progress I was talking about earlier. But if that progress slows or stumbles, if human suffering increases in ways that we allow ourselves to actually process, we may start to seek some wisdom in older cyclical models of time, seeing echoes of earlier natural disasters and the ones that we're fighting through today. Another disorientation as regards to time is that carbon hangs in the air for centuries, at least 300 years according to most estimates, and up to 1,000 depending. That means that every ounce of carbon that's ever been produced from industrial processes is still up there, and it's still warming the planet today. And the climate doesn't care if, like, you're burning a piece of coal in 21st century China or 19th century England. It's still there. It's still kind of operating on the same timeline. And what that means is that we're living in a kind of eternal carbon present in which everything that's ever been done by human industrial civilization is still weighing on us and heating the planet. And just to describe briefly what a scale that weight is, we've put into the atmosphere as a species, because of the burning of fossil fuels, something like 2.5 trillion tons of carbon, which is more by weight than everything we have ever built on the planet itself. So we've done more to damage the planet's atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels than in building all the cities and all the highways and all the schools and all the factories that have ever been built anywhere on planet Earth. And in fact, it weighs more, that carbon blanket in the sky, than all living matter on life today, all the plants, all the people, all the animals. We've done more to the atmosphere than all of that combined. And even though we think of carbon dioxide as a gas, it is a gas, it should dissipate, but it actually takes, since it takes centuries to dissolve, the monument that we've built to human civilization in our atmosphere is going to outlast anything that's ever been built by human hands on this planet. It will go down over time, perhaps eventually returning to previous levels, but that could take many thousands of years. And of course, the piece of coal that started that process is itself the result of millions of years of geologic pressure on plant life. That's why we call them fossil fuels, because they started by compressing plants and carbon life under rocks. And that's history, that those millions of years of pressure are also being released when we burn them, which is related to some of the things that we were talking about earlier about sea level rise, which can unfold over thousands of years or millions of years. But every time we see an iceberg melt or a calf crashing into the sea, we are literally watching all of that long past history come undone, and coming undone pretty rapidly. Thousands or perhaps millions of years released suddenly into the present. Which is to say, in living through climate change, we are already living through many different and even contradictory timescales at once. And in addition to following a timeline that we may think we know about how we may encounter the future, how we may design the future, how we may save ourselves from really dramatic climate warming, we're also entering into a time of great confusion at an ideological, intellectual, political, social, and cultural level, which I think many of us in many ways are even less prepared for than the climate changes themselves. So I want to leave it there. Hope we can talk a little bit more about all of this on the stage, but hope you enjoyed that stonery tour of the climate future. Thanks again.
Yeah, let's invite all the speakers to take a seat on stage, and Haley has a couple questions for the group, I believe, and then we'll open it up to your questions.
That's good? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, David. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Thank you, David. And thank you, Amali and Ben. It's good to be part into our conversation portion of today. And as she said, I actually have two questions, and then we'll take audience questions if possible. As David was saying, this is definitely a watershed conversation at an American museum, possibly at a global museum. And touching in with Amali's point on communication, it really shouldn't have taken this long. But I'm grateful to Josh and to Chris and to Megan for bringing this forward now, and I hope that it unfolds many more conversations to come. In particular, what we're talking about here is a moment in time, but as David was saying, we often project into the future, but I'd like to return us to the now, to the exhibition that's upstairs, in particular to two series from Josh's climate change chapter entitled Adaptation. The second is entitled Personal Responsibility. If you haven't seen them, I recommend going up and looking at them after our conversation here. The question is, what can art do? What can art do today in context of some of the things we've been looking at on the screen and some of the things we've been verbalizing? How can art be not only an advocate for, but a producer of change in a contemporary scape in which a lot of our media is moving rather quickly, a lot of data and facts are being normalized very quickly, and how can we slow down and inhabit the very time we're in? Last week, 4 days, hottest temperature globally. What can art do in the symbiosis of internalizing awareness to be able to live and produce a different reality? So I know David has some art contingent relationships, and Josh made the work upstairs, but I'd like to hear a bit from everyone, if possible, as to how you see art can play a role in improving what is a crisis that's unfolding on a daily and weekly basis.
Well, Josh, you should go first.
Josh might like to begin.
Hi. Also, thank you everyone for your excellent talks. I feel like I've learned so much this afternoon, so I just wanted to say thank you before I get into it. This is something that I'm still answering, so you might have to bear with me. I don't know if I have. I might just want to. Can you still hear me? Oh, it's back on. I don't know, if I have a definitive answer. My answer may change if you come back to me, if you come back to me, in the future. But at the moment, what I think art can do is something that maybe we need happening more in wider culture as well, which is finding ways outside of the news and mass media to communicate about what the reality of climate change will be for us as individuals. I think this is something that came up in David's talk, and also in Amali's, and also in Ben's, is that yes, there is the deep future. We can think about what might happen 5,000 years from now, but that's really abstract. And even 2100 is very abstract because most of us in this room will not be here in 2100, although perhaps people's children will be. But 2050 is more tangible because most of us in this room will be here in 2050, albeit some of us will be very old, but we will be here. So, a foot of sea level rise by 2050, that means something for us in our old age. And I think that art has the capacity, especially because you spend longer looking at it, or you spend longer looking at it if it's interesting. If it's not interesting, you walk by very quickly. But there is this possibility for a deeper level of thought with it. And by art, I don't just mean art in museums. I think that film and literature and other media are also capable of this. So that's something that I think that it can do. It's another space for communication. But I also don't think that we should mistake art for actual action on these issues. I mean, I think policies need to change.
Is this on? I'm happy to. So I'm happy to weigh in on that as well. So yes, we need, there's two things I want to say right up top so that I don't lose my train of thought and my meandering way my brain works. We need to be very intentional and deliberate about carving out spaces that allow storytelling and inclusive storytelling. I came into the climate space, as I said earlier, as a humanitarian, because it was really starkly evident that there were no human faces on a topic that it affects all of us, right? Affects us disproportionately. And that's what led my charge and my work in this space now. And so, what is art if not a way to make you think, to make you see something that maybe you wouldn't see otherwise? Whether it's abstract or storytelling, whether it's film, whether it's an essay, whether it's a photograph, we have to be intentional about carving out spaces for people to tell their stories of human impacts, so that this is not something, A, apocalyptic, B, far off in the future, and C, there's another problem that global powers, and we're all impacted by this and also responsible. We think we're somehow exceptional, that this isn't going to happen to us. And that tends to have some very racialized and very power-dominant views. Well, surely, we're the United States. We're the greatest civilization that's ever existed. Therefore, this is certainly not going to happen to us. That kind of thinking is why we have no progress. We also actively demean and dehumanize people that don't look like power. And if we don't do something to tell all human impact stories, then you're not going to equate a more level playing field. You're not going to create opportunities that demonstrate to the very handful of powers that be that, my God, you mean this could also affect me? People who look like me, people who look like the powerful narratives. So, that's why I'm very deliberate about going to Miami, We can tell an economic story, if not a human impact story. So, I think film is probably the most powerful and evocative way that we can tell some stories. And if you'll all let me, I'm going to plug a filmmaker who's in the audience today, Josh Fox, who is working on a documentary on climate refugees. And I'm deeply grateful to have met you, Josh, and know about this film forthcoming. So, support that work. There's a fundraiser to even make such art come to life that's happening Wednesday right here in Manhattan. So I'll leave there. Thanks.
I just, to pick up on something you said that was not related to art, and then I'll answer the question about art, but when I first started writing about climate, it was expected by the scientific community that the pathways that we were on would lead us to about 4 or 5 degrees of warming. It's now basically expected that the pathways we're on are going to lead us to about 3 degrees, and if we get our act together, maybe something like 2.5 or closer to 2. At 5 degrees, the entire planet is suffering in a dramatically and profound way that would challenge almost any expectation of human flourishing going forward. At 2.5 degrees, it's like that's the level of warming that the rich countries of the world think they can handle, and almost no one in the global south can. There's a lot that's baked into those assumptions. I think that they're too optimistic about the stability of the global north in the face of these challenges, but we have basically steered a course towards the maximum allowable level of warming that rich countries believe they can tolerate, despite the fact that the poor countries in the world will not be able to tolerate that. And to some degree, we're now calling that a success, which to some degree it also is. But it reminds us, just to the precise point that you're making, that the stories that we tell in one part of the world are very different from the stories that we tell in another part of the world. On the broader question of art and its power, I think that we probably have to think about several different standards or several different models for what art is and what it does. And on the one hand, we are all going to be living in a transformed and indeed deformed world because of climate change, which means there's a lot of meaning to make and think through about the new landscape of human possibility and circumstance that we have made for ourselves. And that is very much what art does. It allows us to make sense of the world that we live in as individuals, also as collectives. There's also a question of advocacy and impact. And on that, I'm maybe a little less clear in my thinking exactly the line between what happens, say, in a museum or in a movie theater and what happens in our political space. I think oftentimes people can normalize scary futures because of the art they consume as much as they are motivated to make changes as a result. But I do think that in general, one major deficit that we're dealing with on climate across the board is that many more people worry about this set of dynamics in this future than talk about them or then integrate them into their daily lives or their political lives. And the more that we can signal to one another that we're concerned, we're worrying, and we want to put some of our own effort behind it, the more other people will feel empowered to take action as well. There's a kind of a divide between the individual and the collective, and one of the things that art does is to signal outwardly, people are worried, people care, and they're there, there's a community there for you to attach to if you go out and seek it. When for so long, at least in my lifetime, it felt as though climate anxiety was something that you had to suffer only privately, and that the systems of power that governed the trajectories of change were so distant that it was almost impossible to reach them. I think we've learned over the last 5 years, in part because of climate protests and the transformations of American politics around climate as a result, that those halls of power are not so distant, even to marginalized queer 14-year-olds living in sub-Saharan Africa who wanted to go on a climate strike. Those people can affect the climate future of the planet too, and have. But nevertheless, it can be intimidating, can feel distant, and I think art tells us that that anxiety and that commitment is all around us, and that's powerful for political reasons. It's also just powerful for emotional reasons, because it's good to know that there are other people in this fight with you.
I'll just add briefly that I think grappling with climate change, grappling with climate change is going to require profound and almost universal cultural shift if we're going to do it successfully, because our changing climate is going to change life for everyone on the planet. The global south will be much more strongly affected than the global north, but everyone is going to have a different day-to-day, month-to-month experience. Many already are. And to stabilize the climate, to transition to a clean economy, to a net zero carbon economy, it means not only swapping renewable energy sources for burning fossil fuels, but changing the way we produce food, changing the way we transport ourselves. So there's no part of the economy that's going to be untouched. Every part of the economy is going to need to be involved in a transition to a zero carbon pollution world. And the livelihoods and jobs and home lives of billions of people are already being affected by climate change, and we have to learn to live in a new way. So how does all of this connect to art? It's the cultural shift. To really turn the ship, it's an every sector of the economy effort, and it's a multi-decade effort. And to me, economic incentives will be very important and helpful. Policy changes will be very important and helpful. Lots of things will be critical, but I don't see it all happening without also a profound shift in values and culture in wide populations around the world. And to me, art can play an important role in doing that, and kind of turning inward and reflecting and thinking about our situation in the world.
Wow. Those were really exceptional answers. Thank you for the question, Chris. Thank you for prompting that. I have a next question, but I actually want to open it to the audience first in the event someone has something immediate that they want to ask, just because we have a time sensitivity. Yes, right here.
Hello. First, again, I want to say thank you for the talk and all the information that you've shared. It's been great listening, and I've learned a lot. So this question kind of touches on the cultural shift that you mentioned, but I'm wondering from your perspectives, keeping in mind the intersections between issues relating to climate, issues relating to other marginalized groups, do you think that there's a way of working within the system, or must the system be rebuilt to deal with climate change? And in that, is the change possible under capitalism, or do we need a paradigm shift and a fundamental realignment of power and control to combat the hyper-individualism and financial asymmetries kind of endemic within that dynamic? Thank you.
Short answer, no, we need systemic change. Capitalism isn't inherently concerned with equality or inequality, justice or injustice. Capitalism is concerned with profit, with progress. Capitalism is concerned with corporations whose bottom line is about the top dollar. If corporations are accountable to anybody, it's shareholders. And you're not a shareholder unless you're expecting to see profit. So just by the design and exactly why these institutions stand and what their raison d'etre is sort of symptomatic of the change we need. How else do you bring in a justice lens into the conversation to say that Africa, 53 countries, as you heard David say, 1 to 3% of global carbon emissions. Ben's going to correct me if I'm wrong here. US, 21.5% contribution for a population of 4.5% of the global population. That's massive asymmetry. Capitalism isn't concerned with that. So yeah, systemic change all the way.
I think those statistics are about right. But I'm going to give a bit of a different answer. I don't know, but what to me seems to be the paramount concern is speed of change. That I think climate change is our easiest hard problem, again, to kind of take up something I noted quickly. War, injustice, inequity, disease. There are so many big problems that we need to collectively be investing our energy in, but we're never going to quite solve them. The aspiration is to get better and better and better. To me, that gives a lot of the meaning to human history. We've had those problems at different levels, right, for thousands of years. Climate change is a problem of the last mainly 50 years, and we have just a few more years to get our act together. So whatever the tactic is going to be, I think it has to be extremely fast. And so I just think that's going to be a powerful constraint. And we are going to need, in a near-term emergency, right, with the whole neighborhood ablaze, we may not be able to reform the fire department as much as we would like to, right? Whatever extensive and real problems it may have, how can we put the blaze out quickly?
Yeah, is this working? I guess I'm maybe somewhere in between these positions, or maybe I encompass both of them. I think there's a tendency to look for extreme positions, and there's this one way forward or this other way forward. But I actually think that we need to pursue both sides, structural change as well as more pragmatic action in the present term. The way that I like to think about it is, sure, we could wait for the boomers to no longer be voting so that we can have socialism and nice things. But at that point, it will be too late to solve a lot of the problems that we're facing. So we have to act in the present within the constraints that we find ourselves, while also working towards, really what we're talking about is a better future.
Can I just say one thing real quick? We don't have to be so all or nothing. When World War II ended, we found a way to rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan, which was billions of dollars. It's about political will. It's about what we deem a priority. It's about what we decide to care about. That's the inequality we have to address.
Also taxes. I mean, something that I think people lose track of when thinking about the US, and this is really important, and I think it's important for everybody to talk about and understand, is that the US is still the richest country on earth. Europe is still wildly rich, Japan, wildly rich. There's plenty of money, it's just about it, sitting around and doing nothing in like rich people's bank accounts. And I think that, a lot of it comes down to taxes. And yeah, the Marshall Plan, that was taxes. And, solving climate change, in part, probably also taxes, which comes back to like voting and voting for people who are gonna raise taxes to tackle these issues.
Yep. And it comes down to a global carbon tax at some point rather than a voluntary. Last question, and this was one that Josh brought up when we were preparing last week. We said, okay, we're going to be looking at history, we're going to be looking at the present, and then some potential imaginary space into the future, but what can we do to act rather than sort of talk about it? What can we each do to inhabit daily spaces that cause a different trajectory? And I think we all work in different spaces, but I know that we do have things that we take home and that we do change. I know from the museum space, a lot of institutions are shifting to renewable energy. They're shifting their light sources. They're changing their temperature spaces. And they're just starting with one parameter, which is energy, as a third not only of their budget, but also of their emissions reduction efforts. But that's a place to begin today. Yes, and we're cold. But let's just finish today by talking about a few recommendations you have for action, whether that be who you vote for or how you live at home, what you eat. What do you personally espouse that you think you can share?
The things that I always say when people ask me what they can do, if you want to take control of the carbon footprint, the things that you can do that have the biggest impact are to drive an electric car rather than a gas-powered car, to not fly, and to not eat red meat. Those are like the three biggest things that you can do. But I think, as probably a lot of the panelists would agree, these are changes that are beyond the capacity of individuals to effectuate, and that means that we have to seize the levers of political power wherever and whenever we can to redirect the ship of state and indeed the course of the planet as a whole. And that sounds like a really big task, but to slightly reiterate something that I just said in brief a minute or two ago, when I first started worrying about climate, the world had never heard of Greta Thunberg. We had not started talking about net zero. We were not talking about a reasonable or even plausible path to eliminating fossil fuels. We were only talking about reducing them. And a lot of progress has been made just in the last 5 years or so on all of those points. Some of it is empty rhetoric, but also it is rhetoric that is real out in the world that people were not willing to say 5 years before, 10 years before. And that is the result of activism, first and foremost. And it's in large part the result of activists living around the world very far from areas and access to power. There are these climate strikers in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia. These are not people who were waltzing into Davos to redesign global economic policy. They were, as Greta did, she's a rich white girl in Sweden, but as Greta did, sitting by herself outside the Swedish parliament by herself. She didn't even have any friends, with one poster. That was in 2018. And we are living in a very different world now in which her demands and the demands of her comrades in Kenya and in India are being echoed by the world's most powerful people. Now we have to hold them to account and make sure that they honor those pledges and that rhetoric, which they have heretofore failed to do. But there's been an unbelievable transformation in the world's perspective on climate change just over the last 5 years because people who felt themselves very far from actual political power didn't take that distance as intimidating, but as an enticement or a challenge, and they responded and made a seat for themselves at the table, which has changed the course of the planet's climate future in a measurable way. And the more of us that can be inspired by that message and take action ourselves, I think the better chance we have of steering that climate future even closer towards something that's not just habitable, but maybe even comfortable in the future.
On a similar vein, I would agree on the personal actions, but the main thing is be a force multiplier. And we can talk about big ship of state, but also each of us lives in the context of a family, maybe a school, a job, a local community, as well as a state and federal government, right? So you can be a force multiplier in lots of those spheres. This is a collective problem, so the biggest thing you can do is talk, persuade, be a force multiplier.
Yeah, I want to just add to these two things. Locally based solutions, community solutions. Everywhere I go where there are, I like to call them enforced resilience. You know, I think the global north loves to talk about the resilience of poor people. They're resilient because because they're left behind. They're forgotten, right? They're underserved. But what I see happening are the poorest people, women, indigenous groups, the most marginalized and oppressed people on the planet, finding solutions in the absence of being seen. And I think that we, very privileged people, can take a lesson from that and think about all the communities in which we're all a part of, right, that can be, as Ben just said, a force multiplier for good. You know, if you send 10,000, I think it's, someone will check me on this, it's either 1,000 or 10,000 letters or calls to an elected legislator. They have to respond. Imagine if you're working at the communal level for whatever change you see needs to happen, and you bring another person with you. When you go to vote, bring 2 people with you. You know, that's how you actually put being a force multiplier to work. Right? You can't do things in isolation. You have to bring communities with you. You have to be a sustained, engaged advocate, because this is going to take everybody. It's going to take systemic change, and it is going to take concerned citizens that speak up to say, hold on, I've seen better examples of responding to this other than enforcing only, making sure we're safe as if we live in a non-connected world, right? We can't pursue isolationist solutions and policies. So think about it that way, and be a very effective voter and engaged citizen with your elected officials.
That's exceptionally said, Amali. I think we're at time, so Josh, if you would like to offer the last comment and also summarize for our group. Say goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll. Sorry, the mics all fail when I get a hold of them. I might just end by first thanking everyone for coming here again. Thank you all for joining, and also to maybe answer this last question again. Beyond reiterating voting, I really think there is this idea that it's either all or nothing, and I think this is also like a kind of barrier to action. You don't have to devote your entire life to climate activism to do something. You can, contribute in small ways beyond just, bringing a tote bag to the supermarket. Like, you can get involved in electoral politics. You could run for office, but you could also, just bring people to polling places. And, as an artist, for me, I see something that can be done is communicating more effectively about these issues, not just about the horrors of the climate crisis, but also about the desires. What kind of world do we actually live in? What do we want out of our own futures? And talking about this with whatever platform you have, whether that's going into the streets, whether it's just talking to your family members, or whether it's making work about it. And so, I just think that there are these spaces that the individual can act on, but ultimately, that's why I made this work personal responsibility. I think there are limits to what personal responsibility is in a society like the US. The US military is the largest carbon emitter on the planet, I believe. Yeah. And that's, again, funded by tax dollars. And so if the American electorate desires a military that isn't warming the planet and causing mass death, that might be possible. So maybe that's a good vision to end on.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to the wonderful speakers for spending your afternoon with us. And this will be online long-term, should you have any friends or colleagues who would like to listen. Thank you, Josh, for your exceptional show upstairs. It's brilliant, it's a landmark, and it's changing people's understanding, so thank you.